So for question number 1, this is actually a part of the quadratic formula. So this is part of the quadratic formula, b squared minus 4ac. And what you're doing is substituting into that expression. So b is -9. So the -9 will go here. A is -4. That will go here. And C is 5. So when you set it up, you have b squared minus 4 times A times C. I like to write it with parentheses. And then we just drop each number into that parentheses. So the -9 goes into your first parentheses. A goes into our second parentheses. And C goes into the last parentheses. Type that in your calculator just like that. So when you type that in your calculator just like that, what do you get? 161. All right, anybody else get 161? All right, good job. All right, now let's look at question 2. Question 2 is what we learned yesterday. So take a minute and simplify that. Number 2 will be on our test. So whenever you distribute the negative, you're just changing this sign. So this -4 becomes a +4. The -9i becomes a +9i. Combine your like terms. 5 plus 4 is 9. 3i plus 9i is +12i. Who had that for their answer? Okay. All right, go ahead and take out a sheet of paper. We're going to start factoring. Who remembers factoring from Algebra 1? All right, so I'm going to go back. I'm going to go through it pretty slow, so we're not going to do it in our reveal book. We're just going to do it on regular sheet of paper so that you have space to actually work it out fully. Okay, so for example 1 this is again on just regular notebook paper. We're going to solve by factoring. So that's the title for today's lesson. Solve by factoring. So we started off by solving by graphing, which is looking for your x-intercepts. And today we're solving by factoring. Okay, so our first example 1. That we're going to solve is 12x squared minus 2x equals x. So go ahead and copy that down. I'm going to give you some steps to write off to the side. You always start by setting it equal to 0. And that's always going to be your first step. We only have about 4 examples to do today. Yeah. But I'm going to go really slow so you can copy down the steps. So set it equal to 0. And then your second step is going to be to look for GCF. Now, does anybody know what that represents, GCF? What is GCF? Greatest common factor. So these 2 steps will never change. These first 2 steps will never change. So when I set this equal to 0, I'm going to subtract the x from both sides. And that gives me 12x squared minus 3x equals 0. Step number 2 is look for your greatest common factor. So I'm looking at both of these terms, and I'm trying to figure out what my greatest common factor would be. Any ideas? 3. I agree we could take out a 3. What else can we take out? What else do they both have? X. Yes, the greatest common factor sometimes is a number and a variable. So for this example, it's 3x. Now, when you take out that GCF, that's really division. A factor is something that is divisible. So that 3x is going to come outside. And then we're going to write, yes, Chris? So it doesn't matter if you take out a positive or negative, you're going to get the same answer in the end. Generally, we just take out a positive. So when you take out that 3x, we're dividing. So what is 12 divided by 3? 4. And then x squared divided by x is just x. Bring down the subtraction sign. And notice that we have 2 things that are exactly the same being divided. So if I asked you what 10 divided by 10 was, what would you say? 1. 50 divided by 50, 1. So 3x divided by 3x, 1 minus 1. This is a factor, and so is this. These are my 2 factors. So now we have factored it, we're going to solve it. And the way we solve it is by setting each factor equal to 0. So 3x equals 0. Go ahead and solve that for x. 4x minus 1 equals 0. Go ahead and solve that for x. So for the first one, we're dividing both sides by 3. 0 divided by 3 is 0. So x equals 0 will be my first answer. For my second solution, I'm adding 1. And I'm dividing by 4. So x equals 1/4. You could also write that as a decimal and say 0.25. That would be my second solution. Those would be my 2 solutions. And that is example 1. Notice that for this one, after we set it equal to 0, we only had an a, we had a quadratic term, and we had a linear term. So we had A was 12, B was -3, and C was 0. So now we're going to look at an examples. The next 3 examples have an A, B, and C, and none of them are 0. So those are just a little bit different. Okay, so for example 2, we have x squared minus 6x minus 9 equals 18. And we're going to factor that down. So I'll give you a minute to copy that down. Then we'll work through it together. Okay, so step number 1 still is the same. Subtract the 18. So let's subtract 18. So that gives us x squared minus 6x minus 27 equals 0. Now for this example, A is 1. A is 1. B is -6, and C is -27. And we don't have a greatest common factor. Now, I want to make sure you understand that there is a shortcut. When A is 1, write this down. When A is 1, we can do a shortcut. Now, who learned how to factor with a box? Probably don't remember. Okay. There's nothing wrong with the box, but you only need to make a box if A is not 1. Did anyone know that? I know. Okay, good. So for this example, A is 1. So we don't need to make a box. We're going to make our parentheses. Go ahead, make your 2 parentheses. Put your X in front of both. Now, to find what goes in the back, we're going to find 2 numbers that multiply, and this is never going to change. They have to multiply to A times C, and they have to add to B. So in this example, A is 1 and C is -27. So 1 times -27 is -27, and B is -6. So don't say it out loud, because this is the hardest part of factoring, is finding these 2 numbers. But I want you to think about it and see if you can figure out the 2 numbers, and there's only 2 numbers that'll work. They have to multiply to be -27 and add to -6. So I'll give you a second to think about it. Raise your hand if you know my numbers. I got 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 people. That's sad. Okay, let's stop for a minute. Let's just think about the number 27. What numbers multiply to give us 27? So the only numbers that will multiply to be 27. This is where those timetable tests from elementary school, I don't know if they still do those, but The only thing that multiplies to be 27 is 1 and 27 and 3 and 9. That's it. Now, because I know I'm trying to get to a -6, 27 minus 1 is 26. So I know I'm not using that. I know I have to use the 3 and the 9. So 3 and 9 are my numbers, but one of them needs to change to a negative. Which one do I need to change to a negative, Chris? Not the 3, because if I make the 3 negative, when I add it, it'll be a +6. And I need a -6. So that means the bigger number is negative. So it's a -9. So these are my two numbers. See how I got my two numbers right here? Now that you have your two numbers, I want you to take those two numbers and fill it into these two factors. So you're going to put a +3, because remember, the 3 is positive. You're going to put that in one of them. And then you're going to put a -9 in the other. Now, this shortcut, you only can do a shortcut when A is 1. So these are my factors. So now let's find the solution. So these are the factors. So now let's find the solutions. And to find the solutions, set them both equal to 0. So take x plus 3, set that equal to 0, and take the x minus 9 and set that equal to 0. And this is how you find your, remember, you can call it a root, you can call it a 0, you can call it an x-intercept. So this is what we're trying to find. We're trying to find our two solutions. I should probably pick another synonym that I could fit. So let's say root. So this parabola is going to cross the x-axis. So for the first one, I would subtract the 3. So it would cross it at x equals -3. So that's my first x-intercept, or my first solution. My second solution, or place where it crosses the x-axis, would be +9. And that is that. Any questions about how we work through example 2? Okay, so example 3, we have x squared plus 4x equals 5. So we subtract the 5. So when I subtract the 5, I don't have a like term to subtract it from. So we get x squared plus 4x minus 5 equals 0. So again, notice that A is 1. So A is 1, B is 4, C is -5. Because A is 1, again, we can do our shortcut. Make your two parentheses. Put an X in front of both. Then we need to find two numbers that multiply to be 1 times -5. 1 times -5 is -5. And it adds to B. All right, so take a minute. And again, this is the critical part of factoring, is finding those numbers. Don't say it out loud, but you need to figure out what two numbers, and there's only two numbers that work, but they multiply to be -5, And when you add them, you get 4. So I'll give you a second to think about that. Okay, anybody know what those numbers would be? Wait, I didn't hear. What -1 and a +5? All right, so only because A is 1, we can go directly to our parentheses. Now, it doesn't matter which one gets the -1 and which one gets the +5. Okay, so it doesn't matter. The order doesn't matter. Because you got to remember, these two factors this is the product. And when you multiply, order doesn't matter. 2 times 3 is the same as 3 times 2. So if you put your +5 first and the -1 second, that's still okay. So these are the factors. That's the factors. Now to find our solution, let's take these and set them equal to 0. A factor is not the same as an x-intercept. So we have to solve it. So your first solution would be x equals +1. And the second solution, or x-intercept, or 0, or root, would be x equals -5. All right, so last example is example 4. So we have 3x squared plus 5x plus 15 equals 17. Now, when A is not 1, that's the symbol for not 1. This is where we have to make a box. I'm going to give you the rules for how to set up the box. This is just a reminder again. You learned this in Algebra 1. So when A is not 1, we have to make a box. And when we make our box, that we gotta, just like we would do when we multiply, we have our 4 little squares. Top left has to be your ax squared, and bottom right has to be c. Notice I didn't erase these first 2 steps because these first 2 steps never go away. That doesn't matter. So we're still going to start by setting it equal to 0. So when I do that, I'm going to subtract the 17 from what? From 15. So let's do that first. And then, do we have a greatest common factor? Is there a number that goes into 3, 5, and 2? Nope. So now let's make our box. So let's make our box for this trinomial. The A term, which is 3x squared, that's going to go right here. And the B term, which is -2, is going to go here. you still need to find, let me go ahead and label A, B, and C. So this is A, B, and C. So we still need to find our two numbers. I'll write it off to the side over here. That they multiply to A times C. So in this example, that would be 3 times -2. So what's 3 times -2? Put that at the top. And what's B? +5. So we need two numbers that multiply to -6 and add to a +5. Don't say it out loud. See if you can figure out what those two numbers are. Okay, anybody know those numbers? What'd you get? 6 and -1. Who agrees with Aaron? Anybody else think that? Okay. Now, here's the thing. Those two numbers can flip-flop. See, this has to be here and this has to be here. But the 6x, so you're going to add these two to these two squares. And you're going to add an x to it. So we're going to put a 6x in one box and a -1x in the other box. And the order of these two can reverse. So now you're looking two squares at a time and you're taking out the GCF. So looking at these two squares, only looking at the two squares that I'm pointing to on the screen, what would be the GCF of these two squares? 3x. So we can take out a 3, but we can also take out an x. So 3x is going to go right here. Go ahead and write your 3x right there. Now when we look at the bottom row, the only thing that goes into 1 is 1. There is no other number that can divide into 1 except for 1. So I know I'm taking out a 1, but because it's touching a negative, it has to be a -1. Because the sign touches the square. It takes the sign of the square it's closest to. So because it's closest to a negative, then that has to be a -1 that I take out. And that's important because if you take out a positive, then you're going to get the wrong number for your root. All right. Looking at these two, again, because I have this 1, I know I have to take out a 1. But I can also take out a what? What else do these two squares have in common? X. So we can take out a 1x or an x. And then our last two squares, what can I take out of these two? 6 and 2 can both be divided by 2. Now, here's the thing about the box method, okay? There are probably, if you were to go on YouTube and just type in factoring, you would get at least 7 different ways. But this method I do like because you can check it. Because now that you have this should look familiar because this is what we do when we multiply. We put it on the outside and then we fill in our squares. So let's check it. It's x times 3x, 3x squared. Does that work? It's 3x times 2, 6x. It's x times -1, -1x. And it's -1 times 2, -2. All right, so I did it right. So let's take this first factor that I have at the top. This is a factor that I have in blue. I want you to take that, set that equal to 0, and solve it. So if x plus 2 equals 0, that's a factor. X plus 2 is a factor. Let me write the factors at the top. So the factors, so I want to make sure, especially since the PSAT is coming up, when you factor it, If it asks you for your factors, this is the factors. These are the factors right here. You don't have to set them equal to 0 if it's only asking you for the factors. But for this example, it says solve it. It means I want the solution. So you have to go that one extra step. Set them both equal to 0. So for this first one, you should get x equals -2. That's your first solution. Who got that? All right. And then for your second one, 3x minus 1 equals 0. This one is going to be a fraction. Okay. Yeah. And I like fractions better than decimals. So you can write it as 0.3, but I usually just write it as a fraction. Now, when a is not 1, that means that you're going to have at least one answer that's a fraction. That's what that means when a is not 1. At least one of your answers will be a fraction. Could be 1, it could be both. For your second one, you should get positive 1/3. Or you could say x equals 0.3. And that would be your solutions. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second to take out a sheet of paper, and I know I have to say this, with the amount of students that I have and the amount of homework that I collect, you need to make sure everything has your first and last name on it, the period, and the homework number. If not, I'm taking off 10 points. Okay, homework 18, go ahead and copy it down. We did these in our notebook. This is due on Tuesday. You do have homework due today.